Gentlemen, welcome. We're going to start in unique fashion. Instead of introducing you to this audience, I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves. Now, I'm doing this, let me just tell the audience, I'm doing this in the spirit of this session, comedy, because I don't want to have any disagreement about the introduction. I was once introduced as a woman said, and now let me introduce you to the TV talking head. And she followed that up by saying, and now here comes the body, the rest of him. So I'm sometimes not satisfied with my introductions. Anyway, I'll briefly say that we have here an intellectual odd couple. Professor George, as I've told you, is a leading conservative scholar. Professor West, a leading socialist philosopher. But they are friends. So, in alphabetical order, Professor George, let me ask you, 2 minutes, tell us about the people, the events, the ideas that shaped your mind, shaped you.
Well, thank you, Juan. And first, I want to thank Governor Bush, my dear old friend, and the persons associated with the governor for the invitation to Cornel and me to be here with you. If there's something that we all agree about, it's the importance of education and of quality education for each and every American child. Juan, it's an honor to be on the stage with you. I've spent many wonderful hours shouting at you on TV.
I'm sure.
It's great to be here in person. I don't have to shout.
You just tell me off right here.
Normal voice.
I know. Right?
So, Juan, I was born and brought up in the hills of West Virginia, where banjos are issued to little boys at birth, and I grew up as a banjo player, and I still am a banjo player. Cornel and I sometimes sing together. I did a little banjo picking along with us.
It was more than picking, though. You can play that thing.
Well,
you can play that.
Both of my grandfathers were coal miners. Both were immigrants. I'm the first in my family to go to college. I was spared the coal mines, I think, really, by World War II. Now, I was born 10 years after World War II, but it was World War II that enabled my father to escape the coal mines. He was drafted into service, served with great distinction in Normandy and Brittany, and when he came back to the United States, it was a different world with different opportunities. Those opportunities did not include for him or my mother an opportunity to go to college, but they were determined that their 5 children, their 5 sons, all boys, I'm the oldest, would get college education. So off I went to college. I went to Swarthmore College, where in my sophomore year I encountered an ancient Greek I had never heard of before named Plato. I read a dialogue of his called the Gorgias, and it fundamentally transformed my life. It got me to understand for the first time in my life that the reason we should engage each other in dialogue, in debate, in discussion, is not to advance the cause of our tribe or group or clan or party, but rather to seek the truth. That dialogue partners, if they're serious, are not out for victory. They're not out to win, to prevail over each other, to win the battle for the tribe or the clan or the party, but rather to get at the truth of things. And that set me on my vocational path. So, with my parents and grandparents' good influence, with the opportunity that I had to study first in college and then on to Harvard to law school and a master's degree in theological studies, and then on to Oxford for my doctorate in philosophy of law. My main interest there was in the relationship between law and morality. I was interested in that great question that Martin Luther King discusses in the letter from Birmingham jail. How do we know the difference between just law and unjust law? Is there a law higher than the human law, higher than the positive law? King tells us that there is. Here he's in line with the great tradition of Christian and pagan thinkers, going back to St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, in the Middle Ages, back to Aristotle and Plato in antiquity, arguing that, yes, there is a higher law, a natural law, a law of reason, and ultimately a law of God, by which the human law is to be judged just or unjust. And while the human law binds us in conscience when it's just, it loses its binding power, its conscience binding power when it is unjust. So we have to be attentive to the question of the justice or injustice of the laws. And those questions have been at the center of my own scholarship and teaching for the 36 years that I've been blessed to teach at Princeton University. And the final thing that I'll say is that an enormous blessing came into my life in 2005 and 2006 when Brother West and I began teaching together, when we first taught our seminar called Adventures in Ideas together, where we began again with the Greeks. We assigned the students for their first reading Sophocles' Antigone, which raises again that great question of how do we determine the justice or injustice of the laws. Okay. And then we read Plato's Dialogues and St. Augustine and on up to writers in the 20th century. Right and left, we read Marx, we read Hayek, we read John Dewey, we read C.S. Lewis, we read Martin Luther King. And since that time, where we began teaching together, we've then started lecturing together, writing together, singing together, praying together.
Have you ever preached? Because you take 2 minutes like a preacher.
I do.
I'm telling you. You know?
And you're really lucky because as a professor, I'm programmed to speak in 50 minutes.
Yeah, really. I mean, I know. So I give up.
Over to Brother West.
Now, wait a minute. So what am I going to get from Cornel West? Anyway, the idea, Dr. West, is 2 minutes, but I'm going to say do what you can.
You're very kind. You're very kind.
To introduce
to
this audience the people, the events, the ideas that shaped you.
No, see, usually we Baptists take much more time than the Catholics. But when the Spirit hits, the Spirit hits. No control. We are humbled by the Spirit. But it's a blessing to see you, though, brother.
I appreciate that.
We've been in dialogue a long, long time, and I've always appreciated the ways in which you wrestle. Even when we have deep disagreements, you always have that precious smile on your face, and that makes a difference.
It does.
It does. It makes a big difference. No, but very briefly, I am who I am because somebody loved me. Somebody cared for me and attended to me. So I'm my mama's child and my daddy's kid. That's the highest honor I could ever have. And Brother Robbie's met Mom, see, so he knows I'm not lying. Oh, no, she was principal. There's an elementary school named after her in Sacramento, California, Irene B. West. Just nobody like her. My father the same way in terms of what the Greeks would call arete, moral, spiritual excellence of integrity, honesty, decency, generosity. I'm a product of Shiloh Baptist Church on the chocolate side of Sacramento, California. Reverend Willie P. Cook, Sarah Ray, and Deacon Hinton taught us that if the kingdom of God is within us, then everywhere we go, we ought to leave a little heaven behind. And I'm that kind of fundamentalist Christian. You see, heaven behind leaving Christian. Because I come from a people who've been hated so chronically and yet still dish out love warriors every generation. Terrorize and yet produce freedom fighters. Freedom for everybody, not black versions of the Ku Klux Klan when the Klan come at us. No. Here comes Frederick Douglass. Here comes Sojourner Truth. Here comes Harriet Tubman. Here comes Martin King. Here comes John Coltrane's Love Supreme. That's my tradition. Traumatized people produce wounded healers. We were talking about Chicago Table, the Curtis Mayfields and the Chaka Khans and the joy spreaders like Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald. That is what has gone into the shaping of the cracked vessel that I am. So I try to love my crooked neighbor with my crooked heart.
And what about your education?
That is my education.
I can believe that. But I'm talking about your formal education.
That is my education. All the rest of it is just additive.
Well, just for our sake.
Yeah, I tell you. No, when I went to Harvard and Princeton and so forth, my soul had already been shaped. The lens through which I view the world had already been set in place. I look at the world through the lens of the cross, and that cross signifies unarmed truth and unconditional love. So it had already been shaped. So I'm coming into Harvard and Princeton saying, now what kind of skills and insight and wisdom can I tease out? Even when I have deep disagreements with my dear brother, he has a right to be wrong. I have a right to be wrong too.
Right.
We learn so much from each other. And then we discover the overlap that we have was much deeper than we thought.
There you go.
Absolutely.
Now, so you went to Swarthmore and then Harvard. You went to Harvard and then
Princeton.
And you're both philosophy majors?
Yeah.
There's 3 philosophy majors on the dais here. Look at that.
You majored in philosophy too?
Yeah.
Swarthmore?
No, I went to Haverford.
Oh, with the Quakers. Huh?
But so's the Swarthmore. So Swarthmore.
I see.
All right. Now that we know the two of you, I want to introduce you to this audience. This audience are people in state legislatures or in the legislative process or education professionals. Now I've seen that both of you have spoken about the legislative process as a moral process. So I want you to take a second and tell us, how can moral ideas be created through the process of policy making? Who would like to start?
You want to jump right in, brother?
Well, we philosophers often distinguish personal morality from political morality. Personal morality has to do with how we should lead our lives as individuals, as members of families, members of communities, members of churches, Little League coaches, and so forth and so on. And political morality is about the norms that should govern our polity, the principles of justice, human rights, and so forth that should govern our polity. But I think it's very important not to exaggerate the distinction. Whether we're thinking about personal morality or political morality, the fundamental question, as King articulates it, I think entirely correctly in the letter from Birmingham jail, is what makes for the uplifting of the human spirit? What makes for the flourishing of the human being in all the various dimensions in which a human being can flourish or fail to flourish? And what goes contrary to that? In condemning the segregation regime, in condemning Jim Crow, King doesn't simply say, it's not fair. He says, what happens is, with segregation, the segregated are given a false sense of inferiority, the segregator is given a false sense of superiority, and neither flourish as human beings. Both are lessened, both are diminished, not just the victim. The perpetrator diminishes himself. So I think whether we're talking about how to lead our lives, conduct ourselves in our families and communities, or in legislative bodies, or as executive officers like Governor Hutchinson and former Governor Bush in carrying out executive functions, we have to ask, what is for the flourishing of human beings and what is contrary to it? And remember, we flourish not just in one way, but across a range of ways. We're biological creatures. We're animals, rational animals to be sure, but we're organisms. And so public health is a concern of legislators. We're concerned about the well-being of people's bodies in a pandemic, or even when we're not in a pandemic. The powers of government, as traditionally understood, go to public health, safety, and morals. Public health is a concern. Public safety is a concern, why we're concerned about crime and disorder and so forth. But public morality is a concern as well, what we can flourish or fail to flourish in respect of our moral character, just as we can flourish or fail to flourish in respect of our biological
Let me
well-being.
interrupt and say, okay, so but when it comes to politics, how does the emphasis on morality get into the difficult work, people call it sausage making in some cases, of getting that legislation? When you look at a piece of legislation, do you ever think to yourself, is this moral?
Yes, I ask myself the first question, is it just or unjust? Or is it some sort of mixture of justice and injustice? What is its impact on the actual people who will be subject to the legislation? What's its overall impact on the flourishing of human beings? The people for whom I'm responsible as a legislator.
Absolutely. I think what is distinctive about democratic regimes is that there has to be a significant slice of citizens who are fundamentally committed to the dignity and sanctity of those Sly Stone called everyday people, ordinary people. Democracies are very rare in the history of the species. And they tend not to last too long. Plato's Critique of Democracy, right? It's going to degenerate into a hedonism and a narcissism and a chaos, because the Machiavellian elements are going to push out any moral or ethical dimension, and so you end up with a tyrant. So Plato would always see what we'd call neo-fascism flowing out of democracy, because the democracies themselves would suffer from such pervasive spiritual decay, unruly passion, and willful ignorance. Willful ignorance. Now, Plato ought to be the skeleton in every person's closet who's committed to democracy, because you have to have countervailing forces against his claims in order for democracies to survive. Not at the level of abstract argument. Lived experience, civic virtue enacted, not just by politicians, but by citizens as a whole, because politicians are just as cracked as we are. They're just as fallen and fine. Is that right, too Am I telling the truth? I know we got the head of the Senate from over there. Am I telling the truth? Absolutely. But by being cracked, it means they also have, they've got proclivities toward the good. They've got proclivities toward the gangster-like. And by gangster-like, what I really mean is beyond hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. As long as you're a hypocrite, at least you know you got standards. You're just falling short. You see, what we're suffering from in this country is the gangsterization, where the standards are gone. You just say anything, do anything, get away with it. I'm obsessed with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. Survival of the slickest. No democracy can survive.
This is just power. Are you describing power hungry, like, as long as I win, it doesn't matter?
It's Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic. Right. Might makes right, power dictates morality, and I'll get away with anything I want. That was part of the challenge against Brother Trump that we talked about, right? This sense that saying and doing anything and thinking you can get away with it. No, there's something called integrity, there's something called accountability, there's something called responsibility. We can disagree with you, but you can't say anything and think you can get away with it. There has to be some mechanism in place. And once that becomes a sign and a symptom of a larger culture, then we're sliding down the slope that Plato talked about.
You wanted to interject.
Yeah. How many of you have read those op-ed pieces that were published by Madison and Hamilton and Jay to try to persuade New York to ratify the proposed Constitution? We called them the Federalist Papers. How many of you have read the Federalist Papers? What do our founding fathers condemn? What political system did they reject in those Federalist Papers? Yeah, you got it right. You remember correctly. Democracy. Now you say, Professor George. My students say, Professor George. Wait, we're a democracy, right? I mean, our founding fathers established a democracy. We're not a dictatorship. We're not an oligarchy. But they specifically, explicitly reject the idea of democracy and say, no, we don't want a democracy. Democracy murdered Socrates. We want a republic. And a republic will have democratic elements, and those are good, but those democratic elements, because they can devolve into the rule of the mob, they can devolve into what killed Socrates, need to be balanced by counter-majoritarian, counter-democratic principles as well. So we're what political scientists call a mixed regime. We're not a pure democracy. And today we celebrate democracy and we use that term, and I think we use it meaning a system like the American system. But the American system is not a pure democracy, and we wouldn't want a pure democracy because it is prone to the very problems that Cornel has put his finger on, and those problems need to be checked. The Madisonian system that our Constitution establishes is one in which power checks power. We don't want to liberate legislators to go out and say, do the right thing. Whatever you do is fine. Do the right thing. No, we need checks on everybody's power. Executive power, legislative power, and executive power.
All right. So in the current environment of American politics, shouting, name-calling, bullying, demeaning, it's rewarded. It's rewarded with TV appearances. It's rewarded in terms of fundraising because it excites people on social media.
Right.
No, that's true.
Agreeing to talk, to reason, to compromise, it becomes a daring act. In some ways, you can be cast aside by the mainstream of a body of American politics in this moment because you are willing to reason and compromise. So let me ask you to speak to the audience directly. Dr. West, I'll ask you to go first this time. How do you go about engaging on a political basis with people with whom you disagree?
Well, the first thing you want to do is stay in contact with their humanity. They got mamas and daddies and kids, and it's never reducible to politics. My profound love for this brother is not reducible to agreement on public policy at all. You know, our brotherhood is cut so much deeper than him being right or wrong. I love his wife, his kids. He loved my wife and kids and so forth. So at that deep human level, this is a spiritual issue. It's not just political, you see. And spiritual is not some ephemeral thing. It has to do with character. It has to do with characters. Like, you know, Romans 5:3, you start with the suffering and then the endurance and then character, and from that comes hope. That's Jewish brother Paul in the New Testament. Now, he didn't get everything right, but he's got some profound things to say. So the issue of character and integrity cuts deeper than even moralistic formulations. Because if you're a liar, no matter how right you are in your analysis, you're not saying what you mean and mean what you say. You're just saying something to get over. That's empty, you see. And it will not survive in terms of sustaining families, communities, human lives of quality. And so the virtues is not a plaything. No, not at all.
So you say get to know.
Get to know folks. If you meet somebody in the right way, you ask them, how's your mama doing? How's your grandfather doing? Oh, really? You concerned about my mom? Well, I just want to know how she's doing. I know you're wrong on a lot of issues. We'll get to that later. But there's something to talk about that allows them to open themselves and be candid and honest enough so that when you then proceed in the conversation, you've got some small slice of maybe trust in the process. We live at a moment in which distrust, paranoia is pervasive.
It is. Professor?
Well, first thing I'd like to point out is that Cornel's right, that getting to know each other means getting to know each other's families. And Cornel and I have done that, and it's been such a blessing. Cornel's brilliant and beautiful daughter, Zaytun, was admitted to both Harvard, where her daddy was teaching, and Princeton, where her Uncle Robbie was teaching. And she made the right decision. Go to school. You know? That's not a matter of ideology. Sean, Juan, you put your finger on it, a really difficult problem in our society, a really bad thing that's going on. And I think I'm going to follow Amy Chua of Yale and call that tribalism. We've fallen into tribalism. So I am going to be suspicious of anybody who doesn't sometimes break with his or her tribe, because it's just not plausible to think that there is always going to be one side that's going to be right about everything. It's just not plausible to think that, given human history, right? Reasonable people of goodwill can and do disagree about too many things. And a great many of the things that are embraced by but just take the two political parties, or the two, broadly speaking, ideological movements, conservative and progressive. A lot of what they've ended up embracing is just a contingent fact of history, that they're there rather than here. I mean, just think of the abortion issue. There was a time in our lifetimes, governors, right? You'll remember this, in our life, one in your lifetime, when there were lots of pro-life liberals and there were lots of pro-choice conservatives. It didn't shake down into the conservatives are pro-life and the liberals are pro-choice. That's a contingent fact of history that it's come down there. So given that reasonable people of goodwill can and do disagree, given the unlikeliness that one tribe is going to be always right about everything and the other tribe is always going to be wrong, I'm going to be suspicious of anybody who's always with the tribe. That person's going to look to me like a hack, whether it's a politician or a pundit or whatever it is, that person's going to look like that's a person who's not thinking for himself. And if Cornel and I stand for anything together, and if there's a message we give our students is, you've got to think for yourself. Don't be a tribalist. There are times you have to break with the tribe because what the tribe is doing is wrong and you can't go along with it. Now, we have both learned from experience that you pay a price for that. Right. But if you're unwilling to pay that price, then you've just become a tribalist. You've just become an ideologue, and you're on your way to being not only an ideologue, but a demagogue.
Absolutely. You see, Brother Juan, you remember now, the anthem of black people is lift every voice. It's not lift every echo. You see? Not lift every echo. If you are an extension of an echo chamber, you'll never be a jazz man or a blues woman. No. Because you got to find your voice. And finding your voice is like finding your fingerprint. It is so unique and singular. It makes you irreproducible given the sanctity and dignity you have being made in the image and likeness of God. Mm-hmm. And therefore the question becomes Socratic. Think critically for yourself by listening to other voices, the dead and the quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then loving for yourself. Don't even ask your mama for permission of who you love. Maybe consultation. But not permission. You see what I mean? And then the courage to hope.
To hope.
The hope. And hope's a verb as well as a virtue. You got to stay in movement.
All right.
Yeah, it's not static now.
Now, tomorrow, this audience gets to hear from Amanda Ripley. And Amanda makes an interesting point, I read, which is that she believes there are more people like the two of you than the tribalist, the extremist, even though the extremists tend to dominate. From Twitter to TV, they are the loudest voices. But she believes there are more people who actually are reasonable and want to find solutions. Do you agree?
What do you think, though, bro?
Well, we're three philosophers. We need a social scientist. I think people are poised, a great mass of people in the middle are poised to go in either direction. They can be pushed or pulled further and further into tribalism, or they can move away from that. I think they're only going to be able to move away from that if there are role models. This is why even religious traditions understand the importance of saints. There need to be role models, people who show through their courage, through their willingness to take the slings and arrows, suffer the consequences, that they are willing to be reasonable, to not simply go along with the tribe, to not be an ideologue. This is especially true with our young people. If our young people do not see grown-ups who are willing to stand fast and not fall into the tribalist spirit, if they don't see them, those young people are going to fall into tribalism. They're already teetering on the edge, and many of them have already gone over the edge into it. And if we're going to stop this from being an avalanche, we need role models, and I just don't see enough role models out there. And they can't just be, I mean, it certainly would be great if we had some politicians because they're in the public eye, but it's got to be pundits, it's got to be teachers, it's got to be coaches, it's got to be people really across the spectrum of professions and roles in life. It's hard to do because we human beings naturally crave approval. We like applause. We can get addicted to it. I often say applause is a drug more addictive than heroin. Once you get a little bit of it, you want more. And you're going to say, you'll be tempted to say whatever you need to say to get that approval, to get that applause. There it is, I'm getting some applause.
And ironic.
Now I'm going to say more.
Yeah, really.
And it's hard to be willing to give that up. And it takes a certain sort of character, a certain sort of virtue. It takes a kind of intellectual humility to be willing to do that. Now, when Cornel and I preach this message of the importance of recognizing your own fallibility, the importance of being open-minded, willing to discuss something with somebody you disagree with, willing to learn from them, not simply preach at them, when we deliver this message to young people, often we got the response, well, but Professor West, Professor George, if I did that, if I adopted that attitude, if I recognize that I could be wrong about these things that I think are so important, that I so deeply cherish, that I form my identity around, that'll mean I can never really be a person of principle. That'll mean I'll never be a person of action, a person who stands for something. I'll be constantly so worried that I might be wrong that I'll never actually do anything for the causes I believe in. And our only response there is to say, well, look at the two of us. You know, we have been willing to be active. We've been willing to go out there, advocate. Cornel's willing to get arrested. I got to send down money to get him out of jail.
And I appreciate it. I appreciate it too.
for causes we believe in, and yet we realize we might be wrong. The cause that sends you to jail, it might be wrong. There's a beautiful part of the Jewish ceremony at Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. There's a beautiful part of that ceremony in which the congregation goes through the sins that we commit. I was untruthful. I was dishonest. I was harsh. And then one of them is, I was a zealot for bad causes. Now, nobody is a zealot for bad causes on purpose, right? You're a zealot for a cause, but you're a zealot because you think it's a good cause. But that teaching is so profound, that Jewish teaching, that even though you think you might be in a good cause, you might be wrong about it. And so we have to apologize to God. We have to ask for forgiveness, even for that offense of falsely favoring a cause that we thought was just, but it wasn't just. But we can still be people of principle and conviction and action while recognizing that maybe we have something to learn from people on the other side.
Absolutely. I'm eager to hear what my dear sister has to say tomorrow.
Yeah, but what do you think? Do you think that, in fact, she maybe in this moment is too optimistic in thinking there are more people who are willing to admit they're wrong, people who are looking for solutions, than there are these extremists that are celebrated in so many quarters?
No, you're right about the extremism being sensationalized, and people make money on it and sometimes predicate their careers on it. And the lukewarm brothers and sisters of all colors tend to be the folk in the middle.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. But we don't know how many they are. They've been silent for so long. It's hard to say. So I'm going to be agnostic about that at the moment. I want to hear what her argument is. My philosophical orientation is a blues-like Christian, which is that most of the history of the species is the history of hatred and greed and envy and resentment and tribalism and parochialism. And we have kairos moments, moments of disruption. You have persons who are willing to courageously bear witness in that world, but not of that world. And when it becomes contagious, it becomes a force for good that expands, but it's often 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Because the next generation has to meet that same challenge. And if you don't bequeath to the younger generation the best of what has been bequeathed to you, it could be the Socratic legacy of Athens, the self-examination and self-scrutiny. It could be the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem, the genius of Hebrew scripture. Spread that hesed, that steadfast love, that loving kindness, especially to orphans, widows, fatherless, motherless, weak, and vulnerable. That's Amos, that's Esther. And then Jesus, sweet Jesus. Ooh.
Yeah.
You start loving everybody. Everybody. When I was in Charlottesville, and I told some of these sick vanilla brothers, they spitting on, cursing, and so forth. And, how come you call me brother? I said, Jesus loves you just like Jesus loved me. They said, what? I said, you work that out. Think about that. Just that we on a human continuum. I'm a gangster before I met Jesus. Now I'm a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities. They choose to be gangsters. They want to kill me while they listening to Motown. That's a complicated thing. They were listening to Motown in the park. Now that's very American, isn't it?
That's very American.
They're going to listen to the music of the black people while they want to kill the black people who produce it. And they got a Catholic head of the Klan. That's upward mobility, American style. So, oh, wow. This is a very complicated country, democratic experiment. But empire too. We got military units all around the world. We got AFRICOM. We're dropping drones on innocent folk. Where's the ethical and spiritual dimension? Because for those who look at the world through the lens of the moral and the spiritual, you'll always be nonconformist with a smile. Because there's joy, not a lot of pleasure, but joy in that kind of witness bearing, you see. And you will be wrong, because we're all wrong at times. But you hope, in fact, that you're guided by the right kind of spirit.
So it's a constant fight. So let me bring up a big fight that was on display recently in American politics, and that's the fight about critical race theory. I'm not sure that there are many people, even in this audience, who can define it, to be quite honest. And I was shocked the other day to see half of Republicans in a Monmouth poll said they oppose teaching the history of racism in U.S. schools. I don't know how you teach about the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment. I don't know how you teach about President Lincoln or the Civil War. I don't know. But anyway, clearly, this is a point of political rage at the moment. Professor West, let me ask you to begin here. How do you deal with something like this? Especially when people will say, you know what, that's it for me, I'm out of here, or I'll attack my school board member.
What does critical race theory mean to you? What do you associate it with? Because I wrote the foreword to the text, right? Critical race theory, 1992, Kimberly Crenshaw, Kendall Thomas, they asked me to write the foreword. And the foreword is, we all have the lens through which we view the world. No theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing. We have to be able to see all the different dimensions, all the different aspects and facets of America, which is the best and the worst, the mountaintops and the valleys, the ugliness and the beauty. That's true for every social experiment, not just the United States. That's true for ourselves, inside of our soul, the best and the worst. So when a Republican brothers come to me and say, oh, critical race theory, I don't want to have anything to do with racism, I say, oh, well, let's get to your wound. Let's get to ways in which you feel as if that very phrase pulls the rug from under you. And I'd have to listen to see what they have to say. Then I would say, now, let's see what kind of loving correction I can enact to get you to see that critical race theory is simply one set of lens that looks at the world, looks at America through the lens of those who were enslaved, Jim Crow, Jane Crow, lynched, discriminated against, degraded, debased, and then look at what they produced. Musically, artistically, politically, spiritually. You see. And what they produced is part of the very leaven in the American democratic loaf. That's the crucial thing. If black folk had produced a massive movement of the Ku Klux Klan when they were being terrorized, there'd be no American democracy. America would have gone fascist a long time ago. But here come Martin King, here comes Fannie Lou Hamer, here comes Ella Baker. What is it about these folk that their dominant leadership looks at the world through the lens of their own suffering and connects their suffering with the suffering of others? Multiracial solidarity, human connection, and so forth. That's a moral and spiritual issue. It's not just political. But once you lose that moral and spiritual dimension, then it's just all Machiavellian all the way down. There's power, 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 and nobody wins. That eye for eye, blind, tooth for tooth, toothless, that Brother Martin used to talk about, you see. So we'd have to create a context where people can get a sense that critical race theory is not this kind of fetishized entity that is an attack on me, that attack on my whiteness and so forth. I'm going to be white. I was born white. I'm dying white. John Brown was white. Miles Horton was white, whose wife co-wrote "We Shall Overcome," which is the anthem of the Black Freedom Movement. And we haven't even got to Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who could write a telegram to the president and say, we need to forfeit our right to worship unless we treat these Negroes with dignity and sanctity. And he wrote that the day he was going to show up in the White House. And I said, you don't get that kind of prophetic witness these days. No. See, so that whiteness can't be reduced to white supremacy. You got a whole lot of white brothers and sisters fighting against white supremacy. They just got a lot of cousins who never got the memo. That's a different thing. That's a different thing.
Professor George, how would you deal with this issue?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it's absolutely right for parents to be concerned about indoctrination in public schools and even elite private schools. There's a lot of it going on. It's going on all over the country. It pertains to racial issues. It pertains to sexual issues. There are many cases in which parents are not being told or deliberately being kept out of the loop on what their children are being subjected to. And I don't think that education is ever indoctrination. Indoctrination is the antithesis of education. I would prefer my students to be ignorant than to be indoctrinated. If they're ignorant, maybe someday they can actually learn something. Indoctrinated, they're not. So I think that's my first point. And to the extent that the polling data that you're seeing reflects that concern about indoctrination, then I think we got to take that really seriously. Now, on critical race theory itself, which is something that I teach the texts of the classic texts by Delgado and Matsui.
Kimberly Crenshaw.
Yeah, exactly. Right. We've taught them together.
Absolutely.
Actually, and I teach them in my own individual courses, because I think that's a voice, that's a perspective that has to be heard. So do critics of that perspective.
Absolutely.
So do other perspectives.
That's right.
Now, part of the problem with the public debate over critical race theory is there's no canonical definition of critical race theory. Different people mean different things by it. It begins going all the way back into the 80s with Derek Bell at Harvard Law School.
Bell, yes.
It begins with an approach focused on racial history and racial questions, a lens, as Cornel puts it. And lenses both illuminate and distort, but it begins with a lens to look at legal issues through the experience of victims of racial injustice. In itself, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's a good thing, as a matter of fact. The roots are in a slightly earlier school of thought called critical legal studies, represented by Roberto Unger, with whom Cornel teaches, Duncan Kennedy at Harvard Law School, Morton Horowitz. And it's also connected with, in some ways, a very different approach, an older approach called critical theory, rooted in the thinking of people like Theodore Adorno, Max Horkheimer, probably most influentially of all in the United States, Herbert Marcuse, a theory with its own roots in Marxian analysis. I don't think that any of those approaches should be off the table, and I don't think that I'm a critic of all of those approaches, of critical race theory, critical legal studies, critical theory, Marxism. I think all of those should be on the table. None of them should be given a monopoly. So where we're in an age-appropriate situation, in universities, for example, the key thing is just to teach the conflicts. Teach the conflicts.
That's right.
That's why when Cornel and I teach Marx, we teach Hayek. When we teach Hayek, we teach Marx. We want both perspectives. We want all perspectives to be represented. And we don't tell the students what to think. We can't, because we don't agree, right? We model disagreement.
That's
and the message is, you've got to read this stuff, you've got to think this stuff through, and then you've got to decide for yourself where you stand on these issues. Always tentatively, always knowing that you might be wrong about things right now. You know, you might have to change your view on further reflection or further reading, or what have you. The really tough issues get into the fore when we go into the younger years. What should we be teaching kids when they're younger? And here, I think, to the extent possible, it's never going to be 100% possible, not close to it, but to the extent possible, we have to give as factual, truthful, neutral a reading of American history as we can. Not one that is through the lens of any particular scholarly or philosophical or ideological viewpoint. If we favor one viewpoint over another, we're obviously going to be prejudicing students in favor of that view and against the competing views. We have to make decisions as legislators, as parents, as private and public school administrators about what the curriculum will be. And the key thing is to educate the students so that they can eventually read all the different competing approaches and critically think for themselves about where they should stand on them. If you start feeding them the ideology, no matter what it is, whether it's right or left, no matter what it is, early on, then you are really just indoctrinating them, and you're going to make it much more difficult for them when they are mature enough to begin thinking through these competing theories, to think through them in a productive and critical way.
So just to dive down a little bit on this, in Loudoun County, Virginia, where this became a big issue, I think you may have seen it on television, you know about it in the gubernatorial race there. The sentiment was, oh, during the pandemic, parents were looking over the kids' shoulder as they were in on these Zoom classes, and issues of race were being introduced to these younger children. Some parents may have labeled that, mistakenly, critical race theory, but it suggests what you were talking about, which is that they felt that there was some indoctrination or propagandistic element in bringing up racial issues, difficult racial issues, for young people to consider.
No, we have to be very careful here, Juan. Bringing up those questions, given the historical facts, is necessary, absolutely necessary. But what perspective or spin you have on those questions, is it a Marxian one? Is it a Weberian one? Is it a Christian one? Is it Martin Luther King's vision, or is it Kimberly Crenshaw's vision? Those are different questions. I mean, if people really don't want their children to be taught the facts of American history, including the facts of terrible racial injustice, then they are wrong and we need to stand up to them. Right. But where they're right is when they say, we don't want our kids indoctrinated in a particular ideology under the pretext of teaching about the history of racial injustice.
Well, let me come to Dr. West. Dr. West, quickly.
Yes.
But so the left fires back. Wait a second. There's nothing in the curriculum about critical race theory in Loudoun County, Virginia. And what you're doing is you're saying that anytime you mention race, then you are somehow, it's not about one ideology or another, just mentioning that it's not objectionable to tell the truth. And then people say, no, those kids are too young, and if you're a white child, you may feel guilty that you are somehow implicit in all the wrong that was done to those black people.
Well, but there's not too many white progressives who are going to feel guilty about John Brown. It depends on what history you're talking about.
Yeah.
The history is always complicated, pluralistic, heterogeneous, variety of different voices and perspectives. You see, I think the problem is that we've got a discourse that is just so adolescent and juvenile that we're at a superficial political clash. And we've got to get to the deeper moral and spiritual issue of what? We're all fallible. The truth is bigger than us. Goodness, beauty, holiness, bigger than us. So you teach young folk from the very beginning. This is what I learned at Vacation Bible School at Shiloh. You see, I'm inadequate. I fall short. Humility is the benchmark of spiritual maturity in any moral sophistication. When you don't have humility and you don't have fallibility, all you're going to have is superficial political statements and counter statements that become more polarizing, moving toward gangsterizing. And you can't approach this without the spiritual and the moral.
I love it.
You just can't. You see what I mean? But it can't be just in discourse. You remember that wonderful line in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, examples of the go-kart of judgment. People want to see sermons rather than hear them. Yeah. They want to see examples. They want to see fleshified, concrefied human beings who are coming together in their fallibility, in their humility, and still trying to forge the best of who they are. That's why we have such a good time together. We could go to Chocolate Park side of Dallas with all black folk. He's the only vanilla brother in the whole neighborhood. And we leave with an embrace, not because they leave conservative, even though some of them came conservative. Some of them, because some of them, but they were already conservative before they got there.
But I reinforce.
But the important thing is, but once you have that spirit of fallibility and humility and acknowledging that no one has a monopoly on truth, then you have a different space and zone. And if you don't have that, then...
Well, now I have...
Just one quick one here. So if somebody says to me, to teach about race at all is to indoctrinate our children, I say, come on. But if somebody says to me, there's no indoctrination going on in our public or private schools, I say, come on. Right. So let's be realistic here.
True. That's true. That's true.
So I have 30 seconds left, and I'm going to just ask the indulgence of the audience to allow me this last thing to say. You two are, you said saints. You know, the saints are important because they're examples.
But a saint is a sinner who looks at the world through the lens of the heart.
Right, but you are role models for all of us and for this audience. So let me just quickly say to these two saints, is there a moment or is there an issue where you were able to persuade the other? You ever change your mind because of a conversation between the two of you?
It's not so much a question of changing your mind, although I've certainly learned
We've
things.
learned
I see
so
some
much
things that
from
are
each
different,
other.
including some things, interesting questions about race that I could go into that I think I see differently now than I did before Cornel and I started, especially teaching together, where we really have to wrestle with these issues. It's not so much changing your mind, it's deepening your understanding. I have a much deeper understanding of questions that are important to me, on which I have views, because I've had to wrestle with points that Cornel has brought to my attention that I would not have thought of myself and would not have been wrestling with. It's a question of deepening.
No, I think that's true. I think that's true. I tend to be like Brother Bernie Sanders, kind of stuck on corporate greed. And there's a lot there, so you can be stuck for a while. But that doesn't mean that corporate elites themselves are evil. You see, we need a classical Christian conception of hatred, where you hate the sin and still can love the sinner. That you hate the greed and still know that he or she who's greedy is an extension of the greed inside of your own soul. That needs to be conquered daily. As Paul says, die daily. As Dorothy Day's eulogy for Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. learned how to die daily, period. Drop the mic. That's all she had to say.
I'm stuck on corporate wokeism. That's what I'm stuck on.
You're stuck on. Well, here's what I'm stuck on. This has been a pleasure to be with the two of you. And that's great.
God bless you, Cornel. Love you. We appreciate you, brother.
Thank you so much.